Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series. Today's guest is one of the other program coordinators here at Trials College for the Brampton and Mississauga campuses. She's also a paralegal and a registered Canadian immigration consultant operating her own practice as Auxilia Law. And I just want you to welcome. Thank you so much, Darlene, here for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And for anybody who's watching now or has an opportunity to watch later, I think it's really great that you're doing these things for your students and the profession. So thanks for having me.
Now, Darlene, perhaps maybe we can start. You could tell us a bit about how you've gotten into the profession and the different things that you're doing in your practice, and as well as obviously in legal education and related content.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So, my profession actually started in HR. So I'm first trained as an HR professional, mostly a generalist. But it just happens to be that in all of the positions that I've had in HR, I kept getting dragged into more of the legal side. So whether it was human rights or whether it was dismissals or whether it was performance management and terminations, I always seemed to gravitate, or the forces pulled me to the legal side. And then I decided, you know what, I've always been interested in the law. Let me do a little bit of a career pivot here, or maybe not even a pivot, but just sort of branching out and let me see how I can bring the HR training and experience I have and be able to, support small businesses and stuff like that in legal. So, had a really tough decision to make as a young mom, and whose partner at the time is also a lawyer. Do I go to law school, or do I go the shorter route so that I can more quickly get into practice and do the paralegal program? So for a number of reasons, I just decided, you know what, it's going to be faster for me to get into this field if I go the paralegal route. And I haven't looked back since. There are some times I think, maybe I should have went and gone all the way, so to speak. But here I am. I've been in practice on my own since 2011 and a half is what I like to say, because I can never really remember if it's 2011 or 12. And, I've been building my practice. Started out as DM Legal Services. And as I really started to settle into practice areas that I really felt passionate about, or really felt that I did really good work in, I did a rebranding about 3.5 years ago and transitioned that from DM Legal Services into Auxilia Law, which I know is really tough for so many people to say and for so many people to spell. But just a little bit of useless history. Auxilia is actually Latin for helping hand. And I thought that's really the place for paralegals and in their role in access to justice is we provide that help to people who probably could do it themselves, but don't necessarily want to or need some help along the way. So that's how we got to where we are today with Auxilia Law.
Perfect. So, what in terms of you said refining practice areas, and certainly one thing there as well is the immigration aspect to it. So maybe you can talk about what you made that decision, obviously, to shorten the time period to go and get paralegal education, and then added. I don't know if it's a 6 month or a year program. Now it's certainly changed, and it's only through Queens in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But what was that decision like, and how have you found immigration? Has it been more of a focal point in your practice, or is it still something in the back end?
So it's a really interesting question, because when I was in school, I did my paralegal program diploma at Humber. And when I was in school, I absolutely, if I'm being honest, hated everything to do with immigration. I could not get out of that class any quicker. It was just something that my mind, for some reason, repelled. I don't know if I was bored by it, but as you know, JP, when you get out into practice, You think, I'm going to focus on this, this, this. And the reality is, when you're starting a small business, you take whatever files, within reason are given to you. So I found that I was really just maxing out my interest in the offerings that I could give to clients, right? We have a restricted scope of practice as licensed paralegals. So in civil litigation, we're restricted to small claims. We're restricted in criminal matters. We have POA, and then we've got the wide open administrative tribunal. So the particular areas that I was getting called about most, I felt like I was tapping out on. Not that I was having clients, line up around the block, but just at my own interest level and how I wanted to be able to offer services. So I would say it was that time, without going to law school to offer other services like wills, estates, real estate. What else can I do to expand that offering in my business? And immigration just came to me, and I hesitated because I knew how I felt about it in school. At the time, it was I think a 10-month program, or maybe I did it in 10 months because I did get some exemptions at the time because I was already a paralegal licensee. So it went rather quickly. Wrote the entrance exam, passed it on the first attempt, thankfully, and then since then I've been offering immigration services, and those have recently been my busiest files and actually my most enjoyable files.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there is that option now, and it's probably a more challenging route for those who complete the program, like at our school, because it's moved to a 2-year program. So now you're almost looking at it. Well, hey, if I want to do paralegal and then 2 years for immigration, I might as well try to see if I can get into law school because it's going to be the same amount of time. What can you share? I mean, again, for those who have a little bit of interest in immigration, of what paralegals can do without that license and why you felt the need of it's limiting. I mean, as of now, obviously, I know there's a bunch of discussions and litigation and so forth, but what did you feel it needed to take that time, take the 10 months there, and now open up completely to immigration?
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely some controversy or discussion about, interpretation, and for all you students who are looking at this after, statutory interpretation and everything that JP has probably taught you is super important. So there's, one school of thought that believes the way the statute is written, that as licensed paralegals we can practice, and then there's the position of the Law Society that says no, it's without, it's out of scope. So hopefully they're going to make that resolution at some point in time so that everybody has some clarity. But for me, as a licensed paralegal, I wasn't taking on immigration files, even though it was within the scope of practice. And the reason, for me at least, was because by the time you have an opportunity to provide your legal services and your legal advice and your legal advocacy, I felt like I would be working already at a disadvantage because you're coming in at the end for most things. Like if it's a refugee appeal, you don't have the opportunity to help the clients from day one, filling out the forms in the best way. So you were either stuck with the client's work, who is not legally trained, and may have made some mistakes, and sometimes often you're not able to overcome those, or from somebody else who helped them, whether it's a religious leader or community service worker who is allowed to help them. So I just felt like without doing the course and being fully licensed as a consultant, I wasn't appreciating everything that I needed to know in order to be the best advocate for my client.
Now, since I'm starting, you were saying it's like the most enjoyable right now in terms of your files. What can you share kind of the different types of immigration matters that kind of come your way?
Yeah, so right now, my two primary focuses in immigration are spousal sponsorships, which I absolutely love doing, right? People have really unique stories and really special circumstances, especially if the spouses or common law partners or conjugal partners for some reason can't be together, especially right now in this climate of COVID, where they can't even travel to see each other because there's travel restrictions. So being able to play that very small part in their lives at closing that circle in their family life, and taking that burden of filling out those forms and making sure that it's absolutely perfect so that they can focus on building their lives, and what that might look like when they're actually unified here in Canada, and everybody has status. The other part that I'm doing is a lot of refugee work as well, and that's equally as rewarding. Of course, you hear a lot of emotional and difficult stories. So, being able to help those types of clients tell their story so that they're believed is really rewarding for me.
You just touched on COVID there, and maybe it's a good segue into how it's kind of had a huge impact in all areas of the law and even in education. So, how has COVID kind of touched on your practice, whether you want to talk in the immigration context or some of your other matters? And certainly, we can also share about teaching in a COVID-19 environment, and kind of how has everything changed in the last year plus.
Well, I don't think that my practice or anybody's practice in the legal field is not felt any change. From my practice perspective, and the employment side of my practice, I get calls every day, all day. It might be a slight exaggeration, but I get a lot of calls relating to COVID. Slowing down a little bit now that people have clarity with thing information available from their employers and the ministry. There's a lot more clarity than there was initially, but initially I was getting calls every day. Can my employer do this? Well, what if this? Well, what if that? And usually the answer for any legal professional to on the spot questions is it depends. And that phrase was, on loop for every COVID question. Well, it depends, or we just simply don't know right now. So I'm glad to see that a lot of the legislation has actually been clarified, and there was that recent amendment to the Employment Standards Act to allow for that quote COVID leave, because that's provided a lot more clarity, but still tons and tons of questions on employment and COVID, and um, we're not going to have a ton of answers for quite a while, right? Like these cases need to make their way through the courts, right? When they resume to full capacity, they'll of course be subject to challenge, and just two recent cases in the last month and a bit. So in May, we had one case from the Superior Court that took a position on COVID leave, and whether or not a dismissed employee was still entitled to common law notice of entitlement. They said that they were, and then just last week or within the next 10 days, yet another decision, same court, different judge, totally different interpretation. So as we know, this has got to go up the appeal path, and it'll be really interesting to see what the Court of Appeal has to say on this issue. So anyone in employment law is just sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for some clear direction and interpretation.
Yeah, and it's certainly interesting because we're kind of in the middle and we don't necessarily know how it's going to unfold, and we'll probably get that answer, from perhaps the Supreme Court in a few years
Yeah,
from now.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think a lot of these COVID issues are whether it's an employment or whether it's some other contractual relationship, there I think we can all appreciate that it'll probably make its way to the Supreme Court. So, we're not going to have these answers for years and years to come, and by then, the only people that are going to care about that response is the legal practitioners in it. So probably won't get as many phone calls on it anymore.
Yeah, as long as there's not another pandemic or something that we have.
Oh gosh, Jay. Yeah. Gosh, hopefully not.
Now, with that, I mean, certainly both, the in immigration, obviously, the ones that would go to the board, they were always kind of telecommunications. Even if you were at the board, they would be calling someone in, maybe overseas there. But how have you found kind of addressing matters, maybe some of the employment stuff, or if you're doing some other small things here, kind of in a remote environment? And uh, certainly, and I think from teaching, you probably had to watch a number of mock trials. Uh, in a remote environment, which is a lot different. And people kind of have really strong opinions on both sides of the coin there. But what have you found in your experiences dealing with the transition from in person to Zoom or
Yeah,
wherever?
I have a love-hate relationship with it for very practical reasons. I love it. And even for the client's benefit, there's some really good reasons, right? I mean, clients aren't having to pay us for our travel time and going to Toronto court and having to pay for parking when we could really be spending that hour that it might take to drive there doing additional preparation work to actually advocate for them. So from a practical perspective, I think any advocate is going to say that the pros weigh really, really high on the convenience side for everybody. As long as you have reliable tech resources, you're going to be okay. But of course, there's that very real issue that not everybody has fantastic internet. Not everybody has a private place to have that discussion where especially they need to take the witness stand. So there are very serious concerns with that there. So I've done small claims court settlement conferences by Zoom. I've done landlord tenant boards in MS Teams. The Immigration and Refugee Board, they're using both. I think it really just depends on who the member or the adjudicator is and what platform they're used to. So I think for routine administrative matters, it's a dream for anybody, right? To be able to just speak very briefly. But for some matters, I did a whole refugee hearing, a 6-hour long refugee hearing by Zoom. And we had an interpreter. So those are always very difficult proceedings to get through in person. But imagine, how much more difficult it is through tech issues, not having good audio and it's blipping and you're trying to interpret from one language into English, and it can get really difficult. And I find that those clients, it can be energetically exhausting, and sometimes that doesn't translate well, especially when you have somebody assessing credibility and reliability, and it can make those things a lot more difficult.
Yeah, certainly you don't know if they have like sheets of paper behind the screen or something that they're kind of looking towards. And certainly, I mean, obviously, when you have legal practitioners involved, we're bound by our rules of professional conduct. But if someone's self-represented, maybe they don't necessarily know they can't have notes and things available.
Well, it's really interesting that you bring that up, because about, I think maybe 5 weeks ago, I read a case exactly this, and they were represented by a lawyer, and they were at home, and they had a script, and there was another family member who was sort of behind the computer giving them flags and notices and like holding up placards of what to say. And at the end of that examination, they didn't realize, of course, this is how these stories go these days. They didn't realize that the audio and the video was still on. And the lawyer who was conducting the examination heard them talking, oh, you did really great. And, oh, thanks for the guidance behind, exaggerating a little bit, thanks for the guidance behind the computer. And that whole testimony ended up being struck on a subsequent motion. So very serious concerns for things like that. Not just cat lawyer, right? Which was
Yeah, I mean, there's been some comedy of errors, but at the same time, I mean, these do raise serious questions about how well can we implement things like that? And again, I think what you're saying is, a hybrid model, hopefully sooner rather than later, that we can return back to the courts in a larger capacity. But I mean, there are some routine things like, you don't necessarily need the doctor to confirm some of the medical records by
Yeah.
having them come in person, but exactly what you're saying about credibility, it's going to be very difficult to, it has been very difficult to assess behind a screen, right? What's going on there.
Yeah, and it's not even to say that the client is or the witness is being nefarious or is, on purpose lying, but there's outside factors that might make them seem vague or suspicious, right? So, if you've got a witness on the stand, and they're a single mom or a single dad, and they've got three kids that are downstairs screaming at each other, and as much as they're trying to get into a quiet room and just focus on being able to that testimony, it's just not always possible. So that person might come across to a judge or adjudicator as vague or shifty or inconsistent, and that can sort of seep into the rest of the decision. So I'm positive, at least I hope that I'm right, that judges and adjudicators, although they say that they're mindful of these issues, that they really are paying some adequate attention to how it might even just seep into their own psyche in assessing those statements on the stand.
Now, in terms of, I guess, just the employment law there, I mean, certainly you mentioned the daily calls there about the various issues there that come from COVID. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Now, with employment law, certainly things change rapidly and will be changing. And again, as we discussed before, we won't necessarily know until things settle in years from now about some of
Yeah.
those related issues. How you found in terms of providing some of the guidance now? I mean, you're obviously basing it on the law at the time, but how that all changes, with limitation dates getting suspended, and the layoff dates, and all sorts of things that are happening, in terms of kind of connecting there with the clients and explaining, look, it depends, right, as we were talking about, and getting kind of a understanding of them, and them getting an understanding of you about just what's going on right now.
It hasn't been easy, but intellectually it's been challenging because we're trained to be able to give an answer, and those of us who are in practice servicing clients, we want to be able to give an answer to people, whether it's our clients or people who are prospective clients, at least be able to point them into the direction of an answer if we can't give it. And sometimes it's just not there because this is so novel to everybody, right? So typically what I say when I don't have an answer because it's not clear in the law is that as long as if it's an employee that calls me, this idea of reasonableness, I think, is what's going to win the day and dictate how these decisions are going to be made in the courts for the most part. That as long as, if your employer is being reasonable in what it is they're asking you to do or not do with COVID as a backdrop, and, if you as an employee is asking your employer, to do something and that's reasonable, then, I think that that's where the lines are going to go from, at least in those judicial decisions, for sure, subject to very specific things in a statute, right? So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the employer has to do actually more than what's reasonable, right? They have to take such care in all of the circumstances, so a little bit of a higher threshold than what's reasonable.
Maybe we can switch a little bit, and we could probably come back a little bit for some more employment related questions, because I know you're teaching it right now and some of the students
Yeah.
are also probably preparing for their examination. But I do note that you also do help students who are preparing for the P1 licensing exam. And I know at least one of my students here is getting ready to do that next month. So maybe you can just start with any general advice and what you've shared with your students in terms of preparing for that exam. And again, it's coming up really quickly. You don't realize it. We're in the middle of June. As much as I feel like we've been on autopilot probably since
Yeah.
March 2020, like all the days and months kind of melt together. I mean, middle of June. I mean, I guess the summer's supposed to officially start next week. But
Yeah.
for those writing the exams, I mean, that's going to wait till the end of July there when they write their exams. So anything that you can share from your experiences, and I mean, I don't know, you could also draw back probably on your own experiences writing, as well as the ICCRC exam there last year. I mean, for some of the strategies in terms of attacking multiple choice questions.
Yeah, so I mean, the exam I wrote was quite different than it was now. So, I always tell to my students, it's kind of like that show, are you smarter than a fifth grader, right? I often tell myself I would love to take this P1 exam right now to see that, even after all my years of practice, could I still pass, right? Because again, what you learn in fifth grade, because you're so hyper focused on that material, 10 years later, you're not necessarily going to remember that, right? Like, JP, do you think you would pass the bar if you had to write again right now?
I would hope so, but I'd have to. I mean, there's a bunch of chapters in there, like in real estate,
Yes.
whatever I don't practice, that
Yeah.
I have zero idea about.
Yeah, exactly. So, what I tell my current students, what I tell students that I have privately tutored, what I tell students that I tutor through the Law Society is, just like in real estate, you have three keywords: location, location, location. For your P1 exam, read, 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 and read again. If you think that you're just going to open up those study materials, read it once, and you're going to do okay, you might, and that's wonderful. But there's no substitute for just reading that information. The other tip that I have is using that general table of contents and that detailed table of contents. The people who are successful on that exam don't know everything here, right? Because it's not about memorization, although there should be an element, there should be some really rudimentary things that you should just know, right? Like, what's the maximum amount of cash that a licensee can take, right? The answer, $7,500, right? So things like that, you should just automatically know. I tell my students, anything with a numeric, whether it's a 30-day appeal limit, memorize as much as you can anything that has a numeric value, whether it's a dollar value, like the example I just gave, or whether it's a time period to appeal for something, because most people's brains receive and retain that information rather easily. Other than that, work that index, right? Like, it's magic. Know the different chapters that are in there. Highlight things that, some things that don't come easily to you, either because you're bored of the material or you just find it difficult. Highlight it in your materials. It's I don't necessarily want to say this, but passing that exam isn't about necessarily who's the smartest and who's not, or who's going to be the best practitioner. It's really just about getting through the sheer amount of material on that test. And the better you are at working those materials, the better chance you are going to pass.
Now, you'd mentioned the index and then the detailed table of contents, and certainly students have the ability to take it more in depth, so it helps them get to the information quickly. Is there anything that, in terms of doing that you find it makes it speeds up the process in terms of getting through every question? I think it's like 90 seconds a question approximately. Um, or is there anything else that can kind of help beyond reading in the material there
Yeah.
of better getting to the answers, right? Because like you said, if you memorize some of the stuff, then that gives you a little bit more time for another question. But I mean, if you try to memorize everything, then you're like, I don't know, maybe it's 75,000, or I can't remember this thing about one file, or like there's some exceptions, and then I'm just
Yeah.
going to look it up anyways, right? So how do you kind of combat that?
So, I mean, that material is massive, right? So when you print it out, make sure you all print it out, because you can't take your electronic materials into the exam. You can only bring your printed. So whether you print it at Staples or at home, or you get it from the Law Society, make sure you've got your printed materials with you. and separate out your materials. It's all broken out into chapters. Chapter 1's professional responsibility, chapter 2, I can't remember, but civil litigation, criminal, POA. Put them into separate binders. And if you're really neurotic like me, put them into color-coded binders if that helps you. But definitely break it down into binders so that in one small binder, or even just a binder clip, one little package, you've got everything professional ethics and professional responsibility. In your other one, you have criminal, so that you're only dealing with bite-sized pieces of information, not having to flip through 800 pages instead of 45. I know right now it probably doesn't seem like a big deal, but every single second that you save is going to help you either answer one more question correctly or just simply run out of time. So break down the materials for sure by topic.
And what about, highlighting and tabbing and color coordinating things? I mean, again, some people are big proponents of it. I mean, I think one of these things, obviously, it's everyone's different, right? So
Yeah.
what you may suggest or what I may suggest or what some others who've passed it may suggest may not always work. If you just listen to everything, you're not guaranteed to pass it either. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of doing those kinds of tabbings and color coordination stuff?
Yeah, and if you listen to everything, I mean, you're probably going to get overwhelmed and your brain is going to just work against you and it's going to shut down and saying, I'm taking in too much, and it's actually going to be very counterproductive. So try things out for yourself. What works for me or what I tell one student is not going to work for the other student, but I'm happy to give some tips. So tabbing, I'm not a big fan of, although some people say tab everything, right? What I suggest is, again, break down your materials. As you go through your materials, make your own index, make your own table of contents that you then sort alphabetically. I find that alphabetical index per subject matter, again, whether it's ethics, whether it's criminal, whether it's civil litigation, on only things that you are struggling with, right? Things that for some reason or another, you're not retaining really well. Create your own sort of third table of contents or third index. I think that's more helpful than tabbing all the way around the document, because you're going to get lost. It's going to be that needle in a haystack example. But again, if the tabs work for you and it's a system that you've used, at whatever place you're taking your paralegal program, if you've used tabbing before and it works, then continue to do it. This exam is not the exam to start trying this out for the first time. It would be my advice. On highlighting, I'm a fan of highlighting, but only if you highlight properly. You shouldn't be highlighting every single thing, because now you just have a yellow page or a pink page and you have no idea what the heck you highlighted. You're highlighting for key things that if you have to look up a particular topic, right, that you're only highlighting that thing that you want to really just jump at you and in your face, right? So here's an example of one that I share with all my students. Some of the questions are, and this is a totally made up question, what is the time period for serving document A? In the materials, the answer will be in there, but it could be a situation, 10 days, from the date of whatever, or 10 days from whatever else, whichever one is greater or whichever one is less. And those ones are always tricky. So you're like, okay, I know it's 10 days, but is it whatever is greater or whatever is less? In that situation, you don't want to highlight the entire paragraph because it's not going to be helpful to you. You want to highlight the one thing that the answer is, right? It's less, right? So just highlight that one word so that when you have to look to that page, you're not having to read a couple sentences, which right now seems like not a big deal, but again, seconds matter. So not a fan of tabbing. But definitely a fan of highlighting as long as you're doing it properly.
Now, what about, I mean, and this certainly could apply to your students right now, even, right? In terms
Yeah.
of test day anxiety and getting kind of through. I mean, the law society, I mean, when I wrote my barrister and solicitor's exams in person, I mean, there was another wrinkle in there. You're in this room and you can hear like people, chewing or whatever, and that kind of created anxiety. But now you have a different kind of anxiety. You're at home. I mean, do you have a nice area that you can write? You're worried about your cameras and your internet connection. So what can you kind of share from that experience about kind of dealing with your nerves and the anxiety? I mean, there's so much at stake as well, right? For them that if they don't pass this exam, they're gonna have to write it again in the future. So how do you kind of keep all that down and have a cool, calm, collected head and tackle those questions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, JP. So, the reality is you're going to have some level of anxiety. I would be more concerned for a student who just goes in and like, I'm cool, I got this. Those are usually the students that I end up tutoring when they don't do as well as they thought. So don't be anxious about being anxious, right? Know that's a normal response to a pressurized environment. And that's not going to go away. I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years. I love being in the courtroom, and still I always get a little bit of anxiety going to court. And I think that's a really good indication. It tells you, it's your internal um, signal that this is something important. This is something you care about. And this is something that deserves your attention. So don't be anxious about being anxious. Know that it's normal is sort of the biggest advice I can give. And then once you know that it's normal, take steps to minimize. Prepare. There's no substitution for preparing, right? Again, reading your materials, organizing yourself. I'm going to preach to myself here for a second as well. Make sure you get a good sleep the night before. I've even told students, if you've got a hectic household because you've got some kids and a spouse running around and it's just crazy, if you can do it, check yourself into a hotel the night before, because there really is no substitute for a good rest period beforehand. Do some study groups, right? Try and come up with some study questions for each of you. Go back even into your college textbooks. Look up some of those challenging review questions and see how comfortable you are. So, and know that all of the answers are in the material. Every single answer is in your materials. You have to know where to find it. And not all the answers are in the place where you think they're going to be. That's the tricky part, right? So Law Society says, here's all the answers, but might not be where you think it is, or you might have to look in a few different places for it.
Now, it's great you brought up that, and again, certainly, our exams. There's a lot of multiple choice, open book format that, again, some students really excel at, and some are struggling with. Now, anything that you can share, I mean, both from in program as well as for the P1 licensing exam, about approaching an open book multiple choice based exam that we haven't just discussed before here.
Yeah, absolutely. So as somebody who has a part in the instructional design part in our exams, and somebody who's tutored for the Law Society, these exams, in many of the questions, not all, but in many of the questions, there's automatically going to be two questions that you should be able to very quickly recognize that are not even close to being an accurate option. So you have to get really quick at whittling down those four options. Be able to very quickly identify which are the two responses that are completely out to lunch. And then you're left with two, right? So it's that process of elimination. Then you're left with two. If you don't know it, or you want to just simply confirm that you're right, Now you're going to refer to your materials to check up on only two options, or best case scenario, one, just like, I know this, but I just want to confirm, instead of having to look up all four different things. So this won't work for every single question, but for many of the questions, be able to identify. And even if, you have to, write a note, and, if you were in person, you could scratch out the two that that are wrong, but try and isolate on the two options that are just completely out to lunch. There's no way it could possibly be that. The other one that I will share with you is look out for those tricky words, right? For example, which one of the following is not true, right? Or, which one, all of the ones except for this one. So look for those. I don't want to say that they're trick questions, but they're tricky words that want to sort of flip the script on your brain. So instead of looking for all the ones that are true, looking for those nots or those excepts, because your brain is going to read a lot faster and it's going to skip over that word. So slow down a little bit and look for those things. Those would be my two biggest tips.
Yeah, I always find, I mean, the word always there, even, right? I mean, we were just talking about it depends. Well, that's probably something to clue in, or only, right? So,
Yeah.
again, a lot of people are such a rush to get to their materials that they're getting to the materials and they forget what they're really looking for. And now you've bubbled in the wrong answer just because you've missed that 3 seconds you might have needed to just double check the wording there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, another component, I guess, in terms of, I mean, not so much now in the P1 licensing exam, but just in general, is, we do have a lot of hands-on things, right? We have certainly for those who are in advocacy right now, that they have a mock trial next week that is coming up, and as well in other courses. Certainly, there's a lot of components to that. What do you share, kind of, in terms of embracing kind of that hands-on learning, right? In terms of, hey, you're going to be able to do this in the future, and getting ready for, or settlement conference, I believe, as well, to for small claims, to get prepared for those ways of learning that's a little bit different than just out of the textbook.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer as a practitioner and an educator, because I have to, use two different sides of my thinking. So as a practitioner, a lot of what's in your textbook is going to be helpful, and a lot of it is not, right? The textbooks teach you what you need to know, not necessarily how that is going to look and how that is going to feel and how that's actually going to play out in real life, right? So there is no substitute for observing, right? I know we're at a disadvantage now because courts are closed, and there's lots of hoops that you have to jump through to be able to watch a proceeding, but the courts are going to open back up, right? Go and sit there for an afternoon. Watch how these things work, and you'll start to be able to put what you've learned in the textbook into practice. As an educator, right, I'm going to give you the same advice as well, is that there's no substitute for doing. Right? And JP, as an educator, you'll know, I mean, I can talk to my students all day about a certain subject, but it's not until they do something with that material, whether it's do some research, right, to see how do these principles that we've just learned in contract law that are really boring to learn from a textbook, go and do some research, see how it comes to life in a case and how the court analyzes it, right? Again, go and do some observations in the courtroom as well. Try and volunteer. At some point, you're going to have to just do it, right? I could explain to you all day how to ride a bike with no training wheels. But until you get on and your foot is on the pedal and you got to get that momentum, it's a completely different environment. So you just have to start doing stuff with that information.
Now, the other thing, certainly with the pandemic here and throwing things kind of for a loop, is just in terms of the profession itself, and as well as certainly for students, that and one of the things certainly I'll mention it is the the member assistance program that they all are
Yeah.
entitled to as paralegal students, as well as certainly as paralegals, lawyers, and law students, free and confidential. But what has worked for you in terms of, I mean, certainly I know you have kids as well, and you're doing
Yeah.
education, they're doing education, and you're doing your practice as well, and it's such a diverse practice. How do you kind of keep abreast of just taking care of your own mental health, and what can you share kind of with students who are facing a lot of these challenges, and then learning in an environment that is maybe even more complex because you have everyone in the room there, and you're trying to like, hang on, I have to listen to Darlene here talk about some boring contract law principle of
Yeah.
you know privity of contract or something. What can you share with everyone listening?
So first of all, for everyone listening, I mean, give yourself a huge pat on the back. I mean, it's got to be so difficult to learn in this environment. Everybody's got different circumstances at home or with their work or whatever, and there's just unending distractions. So congratulations for if you finished, for completing. If you've just started and you're in the middle, keep at it. And I mean, I think you're really amazing to embark on your education in this kind of environment. Not just the remote part of education is easy. It's the 16,000 really important distractions that are going on behind the scenes, because even teaching this stuff, it's difficult for me. It's a distraction, and I know it already, right? So I can only imagine how difficult it is for a student who's hearing it the first time and trying to understand it as well, so that they can pass their assignment, pass their exams, pass the program, and move on. So definitely not easy. It was a big challenge for me in the beginning, because I teach, I have my practice, I've got kids at home who are doing school, and I was still trying to maintain the same output level that I was. And that came to a crashing halt very, very quickly. The first couple of weeks of the pandemic, I had a cork board up with all my kids' names. It's like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have recess together. We're going to do gym. And honestly, JP, by day 4, I was in tears. And I'm like, this is a nightmare. This is not going to work. So we're doing the bare minimum we can to just get through. The one thing that's helped me is realizing that I'm not going to be able to be the same type of productive that I was in a different environment. It just cannot happen, not for me. And boundaries, not only with other people, right? With client expectations, student expectations, but boundaries on my own time. I didn't want to be working till 11:30 every night and then up again at 6 in the morning just to get work done. So I personally have taken on fewer files in my practice so that I can manage that workload. And one thing that I've really found actually helped me the most is doing time blocks of work. You may not heard this from other seminars or people that are doing it, and it's not new, but it's getting some sort of a revival. So I work in 1-hour blocks and then I stop. So today, before I did this call from 1 to 2, I had some really important client stuff to get through. And I said, I'm shutting off everything, not looking at my email, not looking at my phone. Kids were in school. I told them, don't bother me. And I said, from 1 to 2, I'm solely focusing on this instead of a little bit here, a little bit there, and I get nothing done. So that has really, truly been my saving grace. I thought it was really corny in the beginning, but it's actually amazing. So you don't have to do an hour. You can even do 15-minute blocks just to get out that productivity, because it gives you a little bit of an upswing too. You feel good about being able to have accomplished one thing in its totality instead of just having all these loose ends with 100 things and nothing gets done.
Yeah, I find that if you can focus for whatever the period of time you can, you can get a lot more done than if you're okay. Then phone call comes, email comes in, and then you're
Yeah.
just kind of jumping over and you're forgetting, okay, well, what was I doing there? And then you got to spend another like 5 minutes to kind of get your brain back to that point. And
Yeah, exactly. Especially when I'm doing math, right? I'm trying to calculate prejudgment interest, and I'm like, oh, I hate math, right? And it's like as soon as you get into that sweet spot of your work, and you're like, okay, I've got some momentum, the phone rings or something else. So I turn everything off and I just give all my attention to that.
perfect. So thank you, Darlene, for taking the time and joining us here today. It's always great to hear from you, and for especially for those I see comments about the P1 tips are very helpful. I think a lot of students
Good.
they're very anxious and stressed and worrying, and it's coming soon. And hopefully that helps alleviate some of their concerns. So, wondering if you have any final words of advice, either for your students, my students, I mean, anyone that's studying here at Trials College, or anyone else listening, about kind of making that transition. As we know, we were talking about before, once you learn from the textbook, but there's a different beast there when you're actually practicing. And anything else, any words of wisdom you'd like to end off on?
Yeah, now is a great time for learning, whether it's informal or not. So something I've been doing since last summer is I've been a sponge for new stuff. The industry, not just in Ontario but Canada wide and even in the US has really banded together, and there's a lot of free education, a lot of free webinars with some really fantastic resources. And you don't have to attend them now. They all give free replays, just like JP does, and you can watch it when you're out there in practice. So be a sponge for all of these free resources and education that the community across all legal professions is offering right now, because it's really one of the best things that have come out of COVID for our profession, I think.
Well, perfect. So I'm sure we'll obviously be talking probably right after, but
Yeah.
nice to talk to you in this setting. And I think again for all the students listening, a lot of great things there to listen to and take absorb like a sponge, as you just said there. I think again, and I would certainly, if you have a chance, go back and listen to some of the other people who have come in. I think yesterday we had Michelle Haig, for example, Robert Bird, the
Nice.
Honorable Doug Downey's coming in a few weeks. So
Amazing.
you want to make sure you get those opportunities, because I mean, one of the advantages certainly is, as Darlene just pointed out, is that we would probably never have these kinds of people coming in person. I mean,
Yeah.
especially to Brampton or Mississauga. I remember when I started there, I'm like, can I get someone here? And it's always like, oh, Mississauga. I mean, maybe I can come to Toronto there, but I mean, the profession has really come together, and there's lots of other places too. There's tons. Every day I go onto my LinkedIn, and there's literally, 15 different sort of events happening that week that you can all be a part of, and they're all free for the most part. So, I mean,
Yeah.
while you have the chance, strike while the iron's hot there. And again, the more perspectives you get, the different, you'll connect with some differently than others. So, for all of you, thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you can continue to tune in. And thank you again, Darlene, and wish you all
You're
the best.
welcome.
And take care, everyone.
Yep. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Darlene. That was amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for participating.
Thank you,
Have a
Darlene.
good
Cheers.
day.
You too.
Thanks, JP. Bye, everyone.